It was just another day in the world of politics. Or so I thought. The cameras were rolling, the lights blazed down like a summer sun, and there she was, Cassandra Green, one of the most famous liberal TV hosts in America. Known for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions, Cassandra had made a name for herself by tearing apart anyone who dared to challenge her views. But tonight, something felt different. There was an energy in the air that no one could ignore. You see, tonight's guest wasn't just anyone. It was JD Vance, the best-selling author and rising political star whose story had already captured millions of hearts across the country. His book, Hillbilly Elegy, had become a cultural phenomenon, shining a light on the struggles of working-class Americans. But Cassandra didn't seem interested in hearing about those struggles. Not tonight. As soon as JD sat down, Cassandra wasted no time. His voice cut through the studio like a knife, sharp and unrelenting. "Mr. Vance," he began, leaning forward with a smirk playing on his lips, "your rise from humble beginnings is certainly inspiring, but let's be honest here. Are you really qualified to speak for the people you claim to represent? After all, isn't your success more of an exception than the rule?" The audience erupted into applause, clearly siding with their beloved host. JD simply smiled, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to Cassandra's fiery attack. Little did they know what happened next would shock everyone and change the course of the conversation forever. JD Vance wasn't your typical politician. He came from a small town in Ohio, a place where dreams often felt out of reach. His childhood was far from perfect, marked by poverty, addiction, and instability. But despite the odds stacked against him, JD managed to claw his way out. First it was through education, then law school, and eventually a career in venture capital. Along the way, he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir that resonated with millions of Americans who saw pieces of themselves in its pages. Cassandra Green, on the other hand, thrived in the world of cable news. Her show, The Cassandra Report, aired every weekday night, drawing in millions of viewers eager to hear her take on the latest headlines. He prided herself on being fearless, unapologetic, and always ready to call out what she saw as hypocrisy or incompetence. To his fans, he was a champion of truth. To her critics, she was divisive and relentless. Tonight's episode promised to be no different. The topic at hand, JD Vance's recent political ascent, and whether he truly represented the working-class voters he claimed to fight for. As the host introduced the segment, the tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just a debate. It was a clash of worlds, ideologies, and personalities. When JD walked onto the set, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Dressed in a suit that spoke of success but not excess, he shook hands with Cassandra before taking his seat. For a moment, there was silence, a brief pause before the storm. And when Cassandra finally spoke, her words hit like a sledgehammer. "You've had an incredible journey, Mr. Vance," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But let me ask you this. How can someone who grew up poor and now works in Silicon Valley possibly understand the struggles of everyday Americans? Isn't it possible that your story is more about personal triumph than systemic change?" The audience erupted again, cheering Cassandra's question as if it were gospel. JD leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Was he preparing to defend himself, or did he have something else up his sleeve? JD didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady and measured as he responded. "Cassandra, I appreciate your question because it gets to the heart of what this is really about. You're right, I've come a long way since my days in Middletown, Ohio. But here's the thing. My story isn't unique. Millions of Americans face similar challenges every single day. Poverty, addiction, broken families. It's not just my story, it's theirs too." Cassandra's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained his composure. "That's a nice sentiment, JD," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "But let's talk about actions, not words. What have you actually done to help those people? Or is your entire career built on selling books and telling stories while the rest of us do the real work?" The audience roared once more, their cheers drowning out any chance for JD to respond immediately. But when the noise finally subsided, he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You know, Cassandra, I think you misunderstand me, and maybe even yourself. Selling books and telling stories might seem trivial to you, but for many people, those stories are lifelines. They're reminders that they're not alone, that there's hope even in the darkest times. Cassandra crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. Hope is great, JD, but it doesn't pay the bills. Let's get specific. If elected, what policies would you implement to address the issues facing working-class Americans? JD nodded, acknowledging the question. First, we need to focus on creating good-paying jobs. That means investing in industries like manufacturing and technology, ensuring workers have access to training programs that prepare them for the future. Second, we need to tackle the opioid crisis head-on. This isn't just a health issue, it's an economic one. And finally, we need to reform our education system so that every child, regardless of their zip code, has the opportunity to succeed. For a moment, Cassandra seemed taken aback. Perhaps she hadn't expected such a detailed response. But then, he fired back with another question, his eyes narrowing. Those sound like lofty goals, JD, but how do you plan to achieve them without alienating the very people you claim to represent? Because last I checked, most Republicans don't exactly prioritize worker protections or healthcare reform. The room grew quiet, the weight of her accusation hanging heavy in the air. JD paused, taking a deep breath before answering. And what he said next shocked everyone, not just Cassandra, but the entire audience watching at home. JD's eyes locked onto Cassandra's, his gaze unwavering. You know, Cassandra, he began, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable edge of steel. You talk a lot about representing the working class, about fighting for their rights and their future. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you actually sat down with someone who lives paycheck to paycheck? When did you last listen to their struggles, not as a statistic or a talking point, but as a human being? The room fell silent. Even the audience, which had been so vocal moments ago, seemed frozen in place. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her usual confidence faltering under JD's steady gaze. I'll tell you what I've done, JD continued, his voice growing stronger. I've spent years listening to people, real people, who are struggling to make ends meet. I've walked through neighborhoods devastated by addiction, talked to parents worried about sending their kids to schools that don't give them a fair shot, and met workers who fear automation will leave them without jobs. And you know what? They're not asking for handouts. They're asking for opportunities, for a chance to build better lives for themselves and their families. Cassandra tried to interrupt, but JD raised a hand, silencing him. Let me finish. You accuse me of selling stories, but here's the truth. My story is proof that change is possible, not because I'm special, but because millions of Americans refuse to give up, no matter how hard things get. And if elected, I promise to fight for them, not just with words but with action. The studio erupted into applause, this time not for Cassandra, but for JD. For the first time that evening, Cassandra looked unsure of herself, his sharp tongue momentarily silenced. He stammered for a moment, trying to regain control of the conversation, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted, and JD wasn't done yet. And one more thing, Cassandra, he added, his tone now tinged with a hint of challenge. If you truly care about these issues, maybe it's time to stop attacking those who dare to offer solutions and start working together to find answers. Because at the end of the day, it's not about politics, it's about people. With that, JD leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. The camera panned to Cassandra, who struggled to compose herself before finally muttering, "We'll have to agree to disagree." But the damage was done, or rather the impact had been made. The rest of the interview played out in a blur. Cassandra attempted to steer the conversation back toward her usual talking points, but it was clear that JD Vance had shifted the dynamic. The once confident host now seemed uncertain, her usual dominance replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitance. Meanwhile, JD remained composed, answering each question with clarity and conviction. As the show wrapped up, Cassandra offered his standard closing remarks, thanking JD for joining him. But the tone was different, less aggressive, almost respectful. It was as if he realized he'd met her match tonight, someone who wouldn't be intimidated or dismissed so easily. After the cameras stopped rolling, the buzz in the studio was electric. Reporters, producers, and crew members alike were abuzz about what had just happened. Some whispered that JD's performance might have been the best moment in the show's history. Others speculated on how it would play out in the media, whether it would boost his political prospects, or perhaps even spark a larger conversation about the issues he raised. Backstage, JD shook hands with the production team, his usual humility shining through, despite the monumental achievement. "Thanks for having me," he said with a smile, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But inside, he knew this was a turning point, not just for him, but for the millions of Americans watching at home. Days later, the fallout from the interview became impossible to ignore. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags like #JD Vance for Change trending worldwide. Conservatives praised JD's calm yet firm approach, while even some liberals admitted he made valid points. Politicians took notice, and soon enough, JD found himself at the center of national discussions about class, opportunity, and unity. But here's the thing. JD wasn't done. Oh no, far from it. Because as he stood backstage after that fateful night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were still battles to fight, voices to amplify, and promises to keep. And if there's one thing JD Vance knows, it's that the journey isn't over until every American has a fair shot at success. So stay tuned, because the next chapter of JD's story is already unfolding. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.